As we approach the concept of one world, we are concerned to a degree over the distinctive and definite division of our religious and philosophical life into what might be termed two-hemisphere cultures or codes. We realize that our spiritual revelation, as it came to us in the beginning, though in a primitive and imperfect form, was essentially a total concept. Man in the beginning, under various names, obviously adored the same principles, the same truths, and preserved in his conduct the same moral ordinances. As time went on, theologizing and to a measure philosophizing has resulted in a gradual division until today East-West is rather clearly marked in many of its spiritual convictions. Yet never before have we been so deeply interested in East-West unity. Never before have we recognized so fully the spiritual contribution of the East to the West, and to a measure also the spiritual contribution of the West to the East. Once more we are looking for unity, now upon a more conscious and rational level, a unity grounded in thoughtfulness, in understanding, and in the sincere search for greater strength for the continuance of the good part of our culture. So it seems appropriate this morning to analyze the nature of that part of our being which we call the self in terms of Eastern and Western thought, where it seems to me that this is where the greatest amount of reconciliation of basic ideas is necessary. One of our great hopes, and one that has impressed me for many years, is the fact that such a reconciliation is easily possible. Our differences are of degrees and of intensities rather than of substance or reality. Yet it is so easy for a competitive world to compete on the level of its religious convictions. Nowhere, however, is this competition more dangerous than right now and in our present way of life. In Western philosophy, Western religious philosophy, the self, or the concept of man's internal reality, is very largely derived from classical philosophy. The teachings of Plato and Aristotle, and others of the same general group. These teachings became early involved in our Christian theology. Christianity, as we received it in the Gospels and epistles, is very largely a moral code, a pattern for immediate conduct. But as time went on, and the early church gathered to itself many intellectuals and leaders in the philosophic and scientific areas, it became obviously necessary to supply some rational foundation, some deeper and broader framework to support Christian morality and Christian ethics. In the effort to achieve this end, the early theologians turned largely to the cultures of the Mediterranean area and found immediately available to them a pattern so suitable to their need, so similar to many of their own basic convictions, that they accepted it with very slight reservation, if any. As a result of that, Greek philosophy gradually mingled its streams with those of the early church. There was really never any serious conflict between Plato and the papacy. There was never any real effort to discredit the great systems of Mediterranean thought, that is, on the part of the early church. Rather gratefully, the church found in Greek philosophy the very support that it needed, and by degrees accepted a very large part of this teaching. The two principal exponents, of course, were St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Thomas Aquinas. These great teachers of the church derived much of their inspiration and most of their basic philosophical formula from the early Greeks. They were not hesitant to acknowledge this, and went so far as to say that these old philosophers had some pre-knowledge or some interior intuition concerning the rise of Christianity. Some very interesting, if complicated, and to our mind rather naive essays were written to show how it happened that, for instance, Plato was a good Christian about 400 years before Christianity. Actually, on the basis of ideas, perhaps the idea is not as far-fetched as we might assume. Certainly there were parallels, and the church grabbed upon these parallels as very important to its own philosophic structure. The Greeks in general held the immortality of the human soul. They recognized the self in man, the I am in man, as something which moved from one sphere of condition to another, from one level of consciousness to another. And by the time of Plato, the Greeks had realized the importance of the doctrine of the immortality of the self. They held this internal principle to have an eternal nature, a nature derived in eternity from the supreme creating power. Thus, they were the first, perhaps, in Western culture certainly, to emphasize the kinship of the human spirit with the divine spirit. They had already discovered or conceived the idea of the paternal deity, the God in whom we lived and moved and had our being. And also they recognized that we were the children of this God, the sons and daughters of an immortal principle or a divine being. Plato and Socrates and many others, of course, went to great length to explain and interpret the nature of this sovereign power. But in substance and essence, they arrived at the conclusion that this power was a principle, an eternal reality, an eternal living value, and that this was most easily comprehended by man in the terms of a supreme person or being in whom all potential good, all knowledge, all understanding, all wisdom, and all love existed in their own perfect qualities, and that this supreme power was not only the artificer of all things that had been created in the universe, but was also bound to creation by the fact that its own life permeated every atom of the created scheme. And the Greeks even went so far, of course, as to actually use the word atom, which we may not really associate with them, but they recognized that existence was composed of an infinite number of small units, that these combine to create structures of all kinds and types. These basic units of life were to a measure the basic units of God in manifestation. And all of these individual units were also permeated with the divine and creating power. Thus they were like seeds from which universes could spring. They were the potential source of eternal unfoldment in nature. The Greeks, realizing this concept and affirming it, regarded the human being as having in the source and center of himself some kind of a divine atom. This divine atom was God in man, man's hope of glory. This eternal atom came to be recognized as the true selfness, or the reality, the proper core of life in the individual. And to this, the early Greek numerologists and mathematicians assigned the concept of the one, the unit, and the monad. And in the course of conceiving the concept of one, they formed a character or letter to represent one. And we use this same concept and almost this same letter for our present term, I. For this I, the capital I, is in form and shape, even today, identical with the form of the numeral one, as it was anciently represented. Therefore, the I in man is the one in man. It is the one capitalized, representing the God in man. And it is the one not capitalized, representing the totality of man's own parts, uniting to form a unit. Out of this basic thinking, the Greeks naturally developed their next concept. This concept was of value. Of man, what part is the greater part, the more important part? And their inevitable reply was the one, the I, the unit, the divine symbol in man. Therefore, in this sense, I in man became very closely associated not only with selfness, but with deity. The one also suggested the basis of Greek ethics, for the one represented the cooperation or the unification of divided parts. It implied that all parts of man had some common ground in unity, and that the various departments of human intellect, emotion, and activity, all to a degree were suspended from one, originated in one, and had as an ultimate destiny a return to the state of unity. This constituted a very broad program, not only for coordination within man, but for cooperation among men. This one, in all things, was essentially identical. It was one in all. And man conceived of himself as a creation all in one. This one, or self, at the root of man, being actually more than himself, but a divine self, implied a common respect for this self, that we should not only serve it wisely in our own natures, but venerate it and regard it with extreme affection in the natures of other creatures. It is obvious, of course, that in the reach of ages, this original idea has been compromised. And in the course of time, men have come to fail to recognize or to regard with affection the self in others. They have assumed this self to be a unique thing, set up in opposition to all other selves. Man came to recognize this self as infinite opportunity, and he lost sight of the fact that it was infinite responsibility. So from these concepts, it was easy to develop, not only in Greek philosophy, but by certain derivations from the older Jewish thinking, the concept of a self, a God in man, or a God-man in flesh. And that this self, therefore, represented in some way man's link with the infinite. And also, of course, in the process of vitality, it represented the animating power by which he was a living thing. For if this self was removed, he ceased to exist. That this self should have a pre-existence was quite acceptable to Plato and also to the church. That this self should also have a post-mortal existence was likewise acceptable to both. In some cases, it is obvious that the thinking did not go much beyond this point, but at the same time, it was a ground upon which something else could be built, and in the course of time, a considerable structure was erected on this foundation. Among the teachings of Plato, of course, we find the references to metempsychosis, or immortality by the self moving from body to body. This doctrine, which had been derived very heavily from Pythagoras, who in turn undoubtedly received it from Asia, was also at an early period generally incorporated into Christian dogma. There is no doubt whatever that many of the early Christian fathers accepted the idea of reincarnation. In the course of time, however, this particular phase of the classical thought came to languish. It was not removed, it was more or less ignored. Probably it was ignored because Western man became more and more involved in the immediate. From the earliest times of Western history, man has lived in an emergency. He has lived in a constant presence of wars, of strife, and of corruption within his own social bodies. As a result of this, he became more and more objective in his polarization. He became more concerned with the survival of the present body and the soul that inhabited it than in some future state or condition. I would say that the general belief in metempsychosis, however, in the West, lingered on well past the early church councils where it is supposed to have been eliminated, and was found as late as the 12th and 13th century in Europe. After that, it vanished except to be preserved by certain scholars both within the church and out of it. And a number of the church scholars as late as the 19th century held the same conviction in private. Our main purpose, however, at the moment is not so much the wanderings of the self as the exact nature of this entity, what it consisted of, and why it was regarded with such peculiar veneration. We know, for example, that our Greek philosophers were very largely clinical thinkers. They were what we term today observationalists. Most of their doctrines had some root in nature, some ground in things visible or noticeable by the average person in his daily conduct. This certainly definitely affected man's belief in the invisible nature of himself. While this nature could not be directly explored, as Plato himself points out, still it could be known. It could be known largely by what it did, by its operations, by its consequences, by its manifestation in daily affairs. From this kind of knowing, an observation of effects, man sought to philosophize upon the nature of the causes which remained behind these effects. causes which Plotinus likened to effulgent blossoms supported in space, from which there fell upon the earth an innumerable diversity of seeds or consequences. This concept, therefore, gradually gave us the idea of a self in some relation to body. Socrates points out that by observation and by reflection, it becomes obvious that the body is inferior to the self which it inhabits. It is composed of coarser materials. It is less perfectly organized. It is less vital and less permanent. And to follow the mathematical formula, the dependency of body upon life is indicated by the fact that body can be separated from life. That the inner life departing from the body causes it to fall into corruption. If the body had an existence equal to life, it could survive death. If it had a condition or a life of its own, the departure from this body of consciousness might alter the nature of the body's functions, but would not result in the total loss of these functions and the final disintegration of the body. Thus it became evident through the mystery of life and death, as daily observed by all peoples from the beginning of time, that the animating power within the body was superior to the body, that this animating power was able to come into the body and to depart from it again, and that the body had no real existence apart from the life within it. By this the Greeks came to the simple and rather obvious conclusion that the life was greater than the body. For that upon which the body depends is greater than that which depends. And as body depends, that upon which it depends is its superior. Thus it came to be observed or considered that something in man was this superior being. Now, the ancient Greeks also began to play with the idea of psychology. They began to realize that man was something more than life and body. They realized that life and matter uniting to create form was an operation in nature, and that forms were always composed of a commingling of superior and inferior agencies. Yet in man, you could not say that there is simply life and body. You cannot say this of the universe if you look out. There is something more in the universe than cosmic life and matter. These two vastly differing aspects of something required certain bridging, certain common ground, a certain binding to hold them together. It was inconceivable, for example, that infinite life would become totally and entirely locked in universal substance. That infinite life also had innumerable aspects and manifestations superior to man. Therefore, there had to be beings superior to man. Man early recognized that the planet upon which he lived was some kind of a creature, an organization, an ensouled thing, held together by great principles and energies, manifested through the laws of mathematics. Therefore, the question arose in the natural mind of the ancient, what is this link between eternal life and the grains of sand under our feet? What was the link between the spiritual life of man and his mortal flesh? Why is it that man has in him more than one nature? How does it happen that the personality of man may rebel against his own life? How is it that an individual possessed of faculties derived from God can become an atheist? How can he deny his own source? How can he rationalize in so many ways, some of these ways so far from reality? The only answer that the Greek could consistently conceive was that there was another kind of organism, some kind of a middle link, a kind of compound being inside of man, composed of both spirit and matter, or perhaps more correctly, of a spiritual and a material nature, brought together in a curious compound. To this type of compound, the Greeks gave the word soul, and they held the soul, therefore, to be a kind of invisible being, not the divine nature in its own substance, not merely an animal nature arising from body, but a strange blending of these two. In this soul, therefore, there was something of reality and something of illusion, something of truth and something of error, something of insight and something of ignorance. And this compound constituted a kind of invisible person behind the body, a person midway between spirit and matter. This mysterious person was in one way or another held responsible for the various transitional states through which man passed in consciousness. This invisible person could, abiding invisibly in man, give bad advice to man. It could have a kind of ignorance, perhaps the most dangerous of all forms of ignorance, and that is psychic ignorance. It could have weaknesses which were dangerous because they were inside of man and not on the outside. And it was held by these people that this soul was composed essentially of two natures. One of these natures was from the divine, and the other was from the mortal. And out of this came another great ethical conviction, which was to influence Western man for thousands of years. And that ethical conviction was that it was in man's own keeping to purify or redeem this psychic life. The spirit of man, the real being, did not need to be redeemed. It would be inconceivable, it would be arrogance to feel that man found it necessary or would admit it possible that he could reform his own spirit. He certainly could not be expected to improve the nature which God gave him. But he could distinctly improve this middle nature, which was a mixture of divine and human elements, and was in some way an invisible archetypal likeness of himself, the self he knew in daily living, the objective self, the self that exchanged and bartered and bought and sold, the self that went to war and came home, the self that created families, the self that was over-influenced by political issues, forbid the thought, and also the self which developed certain selfishness, which was entirely different and opposed to this God service, which was the true dedication to the reality in man. So this problem of man redeeming his own soul, redeeming it through the purification of his life, by the attainment of certain cathartic virtues, by means of which ignorance was driven from his nature, the redeeming of his own soul through its beautification, through the nutrition of wisdom and truth and love, and through the gradual regeneration of his inner life. This regeneration was not merely for man's own sake, although of course it would naturally result in the general improvement of man. There was a sacred duty underlying this regeneration. It was man's duty through this process to become aware of his true God self and to dedicate his life to the service of that self, and to plan all of his procedures so that this inner self, the real self, gradually came to be the Lord of his life, to be the ruler of his action, thought, and conduct, and to be his intuitive guide in all the concerns affecting his daily existence. Thus we can see how this thinking came to be very near to the early church. The church was concerned with this problem of redeeming the sinful part of man. And this sinful part seemed to coincide very closely with this unregenerate soul of Plato. It seemed to suggest the same spiritual needs that we find outlined in the definitions given by Socrates. Thus we have a concept gradually arising that finally came into the church on the general ground of limited determinism, that there was something in man which not only forced him to obey the good, but which permitted him to disobey the good. This had to be because man so acted, and that which is a natural conduct cannot be denied or ignored. It was therefore important to find some way to bring this prodigal son back again to the house of his father. Such a way depended upon the need for that way. And Christianity found in the classical thinking, therefore, the greatest justification of itself, namely the need for the redemption of man. If this redemption problem did not exist, the church had no excuse for its own existence, for its duty was in some way to combat the illusions, the unrealities that came to be considered as the basic evils of society. Out of all of this thinking, therefore, the human being sort of developed into a self, a soul, and a body. Now, the ancients were also concerned with the basic relationship of this thing called the self to the cause of itself, namely the divine being. It was held in Western thinking that deity was represented in creation by a fragmentation of its own unity. Thus, deity was represented by tiny flames of deity, like Pentecostal flames. And in each human heart, one of these flames was locked. And the heart became this matchless altar upon which man could make offering to the eternal good in his own nature. This, however, led to some speculation. What was the relation of this divine flame in man to the total flame? And here a great many of the classic thinkers more or less went back to some of the Pythagorean theories, trying to find a concept that would be suitable to their need. And they also borrowed rather generously from the simple facts of biology around them. They beheld, for example, a child born of its parents, and they assumed that this child, when born, became a kind of individual. They did not regard, as some materialists do today, the child as merely the extension of its parents. They held this child to have a beginning in conception. They did not necessarily affirm, however, that this conceived body marked the true beginning of the life in that body. They held that this life might come from elsewhere, but that perhaps it would be possible to use the analogy that sometime in the infinite beginning of things, in the dawn of existence itself, deity gave birth to creation, gave birth to souls, gave birth to lives, gave birth to all the existing, living energies of the universe. That these energies partook, therefore, of the strange heredity of their parent, namely, they were eternal. Thus, all things created out of eternity had some eternal root or life at the source of themselves. Therefore, it was not difficult to assume that once man was differentiated as a spark from the eternal flame, that this spark might have an eternal existence and go on and on and on. Now, if it had an eternal existence, this existence must be purposeful in some way. It had to have meaning, significance, or reason. And man, looking around him, beheld something to which he applied the term growth. He observed that human beings, during the course of their lives, not only grow older, but in some mysterious way mature in themselves. There are exceptions to this rule, of course. Some individuals seem to get worse. But, in total and essence, there was present everywhere a growingness. Things growing onward and upward. And the analogy immediately gave rise to the first concepts of a doctrine later to be formalized in thinking as the law of evolution. The Greeks had it, the Greeks expressed it, but they did not name it, just as we do. But to them, this evolution was not merely a growing on, a getting bigger and more so. This evolution was a becoming better. Evolution, therefore, to these people represented the gradual process of the release of the divine potential. In other words, in the seed of man, there was infinite growth, infinite potential. And existence was the process of bringing forth this potential, degree by degree, step by step. It was not possible for this potential to blaze forth in an instant. It was not possible for man to live in the 10th century before he lived in the first, because in the interval between the first and the 10th, changes took place, not only in him but around him. And these changes made possible the 10th century person. Without the time, without infinite processes of growing in between, man could not move from one platform of existence onto another. So we have this concept then of an orderly progression, of things becoming more refined, more acute, more sensitive, of the mind becoming more capable of abstract and creative expression, of the body becoming better integrated and easier organized so that it could serve the purposes of life more effectively. The world around man, moving from the cave and the hut to the palace and the temple. Man perfecting arts and sciences, crafts and trades, everywhere skill increasing, everywhere man preserving also the records of his own achievements to become a common record to be imparted to those who came after him. Thus there was this great motion of unfoldment, this motion of growing, this continuous revelation of the wealth of the hidden mystery. For no matter what man discovered, or how skillful he became, He never seemed to reach a place in which there was not more pressure, more push, more to be done inside of himself. All that he knows even now remains but a tiny fragment of the unknown with which he still copes. So this process of man's growth seemed to the ancient to be infinite. Now, in order that this infinite might be meaningful, the creature had to become more. This process of becoming more and more begins to differentiate largely between Eastern and Western thinking. Out of this endless becoming more, the ancient Greek, and later, to a measure, the ancient church, came to certain conclusions that were more or less emergency decisions. Emergency decisions based upon available data, available concept upon which ideas could be built. To the Greeks, therefore, there seemed to be only one answer. The flame having separated from its eternal source, there was only one answer to this problem, namely that it had to go on as a separate thing. But because it had God in it, its ultimate destiny was to be a God. All of this great process had to lead finally to a creature of infinite knowledge, infinite wisdom, infinite understanding, and infinite power. This omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient being could only be likened again to a God. Therefore, it was assumed, perhaps, that all the stars in the firmament were such gods, and all those beyond our comprehension and beyond the vision of our powerful glasses today might go on to populate the firmament with a race of divinities, man becoming ever more perfect, ever greater in his own understanding, moving toward an infinite, incomprehensible, ultimate perfection, beyond all concept as we know it. Now this seemed for a time to satisfy the classic mind. But at this point, the church began to change its perspective a little bit. It found that it was rather difficult to conceive or to rationalize or to organize this doctrine of infinite and eternal individual progress. It became a thing which could not certainly conveniently be imparted. It always resulted in more questions than it answered. And in the early church, the great problem was not to answer questions, nor was another problem to create people who would ask questions. The problem was simplification. This faith was reaching out into a comparatively illiterate world, a world of very simple, uninformed people. And the church began very heavily to consider the simplification of its own doctrines. Now, we are not sure that this ever represented a formal step. It's not necessarily true that at any time the church got together and said, let's simplify. What really happened was that the perpetuation of the church itself depended upon these simple people. These were the people who became the bishops and the archbishops and the cardinals and the popes. These were the persons whose thinkings became the thinkings of the church because they had no other thinkings. The church was not able to produce out of its own group the kind of leader that would perpetuate an abstract philosophical age. In fact, this type of age was incomprehensible, not only to the church itself, but to those it served. So out of this confusion, the confusion in which for centuries men could not read or write. Men seldom, if ever, traveled beyond their own village. They had no knowledge of world affairs. And during these highly critical years, they were passing through what we call the Dark Ages. Roman civilization had collapsed, Grecian civilization had collapsed, and European civilization was in the doldrums. There was nothing upon which to build or restore the glory of a great philosophic age in medieval Europe. So out of this convergency came a kind not of denial, but of ignoring, a dropping of things that could not be analyzed. Perhaps the original idea was merely to suspend them until such time as they could be analyzed. But this process of suspension gradually resulted in the rise of dogma, and in this case, there was never any effort to revive them or restore them, certainly not at least until the last century or two. So to solve this mystery of man going on and on and on and on through a philosophical universe almost beyond comprehension, the church evolved and developed, with some borrowing from the Greek and Latin also, the idea of a heaven. This idea of a heaven was based somewhat on Egyptian metaphysics, and the Eastern Church still acknowledges this indebtedness without blushing or shame about it. But gradually the idea of the afterworld was no longer a school or an infinite march through space, but a problem of punishments and rewards. It seemed comprehensible to people that if they survived, they would pass through some kind of a sorting process, the good having precedence over that which was not good. So out of this doctrine came the theory of an afterlife, which was essentially static. This afterlife became a great pool into which all things poured, and from which, in turn, nothing else seemed to pour. It became a kind of end, and there was no longer this thought or discussion of a ladder leading beyond the stars. There was no problem anymore of good people becoming wiser and wiser and wiser. It became sufficient merely for them to be good. And if they became good, they would go home and rest in everlasting peace. This was one of the first major breaks between the church and the old classical learning. But it was not as large a break as we think, because even in the classical period, there were groups that held this opinion also. Also, of course, there was a modification to this. In many ways, this afterlife in a blessed condition or place was reserved for persons whose virtues were perhaps beyond those normally attainable. Heaven, as it was defined in the primitive church, was rather too good for almost anyone who could get there. Therefore, it seemed to imply some growth, some attainment, some continuance of improvement beyond that of the normal state. Perhaps this was the dim shadow of the old doctrine of reincarnation surviving. Some way, man had to be better than he could be to be really worthy of this celestial abode that was reserved for him since the beginning of time. Now, when the church attempted to define what this other wonderful heavenly place was, they could only conceive of it in one way, namely, as a great existence ruled over directly by God. That in this existence, man was face to face with deity. That deity was the living and ever-present light of this paradisical heaven. That in this world, God ruled supreme, and the human spirit returned from the world of corrupt human rulership back again to the kind of a world ruled over by infinite wisdom and infinite love. This very concept itself, as Aquinas shows us later, easily responded to philosophical interpretation and opened the whole subject up again. The only thing is, for the most part, it was not reopened. And we gradually have the conception that dominates us now. It was thus a compromise upon the Greek, this going on foreverness, which did not seem to the early church as useful or valuable as a becoming of something, and in this state of becomingness to be united immediately with God, and to attain, therefore, a relationship with deity. Now, the relationship with deity was again rather broadly defined as a relationship built upon obedience, that man had come once more to accept God totally and completely, and by so doing to have an ever-conditioned existence in God. Now, this more or less, I think, summarizes our Western approach as far as we need it for the moment. And of course, when we speak of West, we have to realize that we are thinking of Greece and Egypt. We are thinking of the Roman Empire under the Caesars. We are thinking of European culture. We are thinking of the gradual infiltration of Islamic elements, the rise later of Protestantism, and many different factors by means of which the religions of the West became far more complicated and sectarianism far more obvious than it was at the beginning. Therefore, also, when we speak of Eastern religion and philosophy, while we are thinking of a broad term, we cannot entirely assume that we are dealing with a religious or a philosophic unit. We are dealing again with ideas passing through continuous change, of various modifications, of the descent and reform of teachings, and even, perhaps at a very early date, the rise of conflicting ideas about these basic values. For practical purposes, however, for the moment at least, we can say that essentially the Eastern experience followed very closely that of the Greek. The Grecian experience was probably, in its philosophic era, largely dependent upon the Orient. And the great rise of Greek learning would certainly be heavily influenced by the teachings of the Far East and the Near East, and probably very much conditioned by the doctrines of the Persians. These various conditions all meant that in the Greek there was already an east-west bridge, and that this east-west bridge meant that Greek philosophy was conditioned. But the Greeks did not entirely give up their own point of view, and this is true perhaps of nearly all religions of the world. They are modified, they are affected, they combine to form new synthetic patterns, but something of the individuality of each continues to survive and becomes an object of common defense. Everyone is trying to preserve something that is peculiarly and uniquely his own. The main principle, it seems to me, in the problem of East-West, which can have moral significance and great importance to us today, is largely in this area of the ultimate state of the individual. That the individual begins as a production of the divine will is common to both. That this creature has within itself a divine principle of life is common to both. The major point is what happens in the gradual completeness or completion of this pattern. Now the idea of a heaven and hell is common to both. But as in the case of Western thinking, it rose very largely late, both in the East and West. Therefore, there were earlier and probably deeper interpretations of this problem. How are we going to explain the self, broadly speaking, in terms of Eastern thinking? The answer is the relationship of the personal self to the universal. In borderline groups between East and West, this also becomes very similar to Western thinking, but there are patterns in which a strong element of difference is clearly marked. And of course, one of the strongest of these patterns lies in Buddhism, which in turn was heavily influenced by Hinduism. In this difference then is what we are mostly concerned with in the effort to determine the self. Now, our self in Western philosophy is equivalent to deity. While in the Eastern philosophy, I would say that the self comes much more nearly to be equivalent with the psychic complex. In this thinking, therefore, your Easterner is much closer to your psychologist than your Western theologian. It is interesting that psychology should arise so dominantly in the West. But it is probably also worthy to note that it could not rise until certain dogmatic attitudes have been undermined. It had to result in some kind of a compromise in thinking between East-West, or psychology could not exist. And I strongly suspect that we will find as we go further that most of our early pioneer Western psychological thinkers had dipped considerably into Eastern philosophy. In substance, then, the self is either the God in man, or it is the man in man. According to the West, it is the God in man, essentially. I am is the divine. According to the East, the self is merely the man in man. It is the invisible person in the body. And this self lives as merely the attenuated shadow of the common objective personality. Perhaps we can elevate this self, therefore, to a term which will distinguish it from personality and refer to it as the individuality. Self to man indicates separateness. It indicates the peculiar value and integrity of his own being. Therefore, we can say it is an individual thing. Furthermore, that it is an individual in the process of individuating or becoming ever more distinctly a self. Psychology, however, does not have much to do with this end product of what happens to the adjusted person. Up to the present time, adjustment is a temporary convenience, and the adjusted and the unadjusted lie down side by side in an expensive cemetery plot. The adjusted person is adjusted only for now, and life becomes an adjustment to cover 40, 50 years of mature living in a kaleidoscopic, ever-changing social order. And man's present theory seems to differentiate from older theories largely in the effort to remain contemporary. And psychology has to do with keeping the individual abreast of conditions so that he will live now through the various periods of his own life. But after this adjustment has all been accomplished, after he has probed the depths of the libido and all related parts, he finally becomes merely one who sleeps with his ancestors like the ages that have gone before. There is no particular hope that this psychoanalysis is going to affect his condition in heaven, because the average psychoanalyst doesn't think he's going to go there. This means that he may become no longer the richest man in the graveyard. He may become the best adjusted man in the graveyard, but he will still be there. On this ground also, the East takes the attitude that this self, which is now not God in man, but the energized archetype of man, a self composed of the faculties and powers of the individual, a self composed of all the attitudes, instincts, impulses, and intuitions of man, a self which is very largely bound to time and place, because it is in one way affected by heredity and the other by environment. Therefore, the self is one of the products of the time and place in which the individual exists. There is nothing in psychology very important or very vital about the self, except that it is capable of comfort and discomfort, and if reasonably organized, is employable at so much an hour. The main problem now is to take care of this employable part, so that the self in man can gradually be convinced that the man as a total being has to make a living in order to eat and provide shelter for himself and his family. The self, then, to the Eastern thinker, is perhaps not as successful an entity as in the Greek school of metaphysics. The East, because it assumes, particularly Buddhism and those schools which originated from it or were strongly modified or reformed by it, according to these schools, this self, therefore, is not inappropriately named at the time of birth, may change name at the time of marriage, and will have the same name inscribed on the headstone or a neat bronze plaque. Name represents apparently the transition of a personality. This personality is born. This personality does suffer. And this personality also dies. If this was all of man, then indeed the materialist would be right. The Greeks could not, except for a few minor schools, accept materialism. India and China and Japan were in the same condition, with the exception of certain schools. They would not accept materialism. Therefore, it became important to judge what was going to happen. Now, if you had this East Indian sattva or self to cope with in a philosophic way, you could go on and you could take your analogies once more, and you could assume that this self, particularly by re-embodiment, could become more and more and more, until it could attain to all of the highest degrees of individualization. This self could lead ultimately to the concept of the Superman. It could make the individual the mental and emotional giant. This self could be trained and organized and disciplined and perfected until it became a master of destiny. Now, there was a slight difficulty arising, however, and that is what was going to happen in the universe if it gradually became populated by these dominant, aggressive, all-powerful selves. We might finally, by a mysterious cyclic motion, get back again to some war in heaven. in which all these selves would revolt against all other selves and finally tumble into the abyss like the fallen angel and his legions. It did not seem to be very practical to Eastern thinking, certainly, that this hyper-egoism of man should just go on and on and on, planning conquest, planning self-survival, planning eternal and inevitable control over other selves that were doing exactly the same thing. Like two graduates of Dale Carnegie trying to influence each other. It could be a rather dismal proposition. Now we go back to the Greek concept, and to a measure, the Eastern idea of the self comes under the general thought of the Greek concept of the soul. Namely, that this self is a sort of compound, that it is somewhat mid-distance between reality and illusion, but rather heavily dipped in the tar of illusion. That this self, then, is an individuality, but not a reality. That this self is something that not always succeeds in being consistent with itself, because the individual can completely change his own notions and head off in a different direction. Whatever he calls himself has to tag along with him. In fact, sometimes it is the cause of his motion. Also, from somewhere inside or behind the physical state of man, there pours into his objectivity a mass of opinions and attitudes which are far from divine. Everything that comes from inside of man is not good. Everything that comes from the outside is not bad. Every thought that man has is not sublime. Every emotion that he feels is not fired from the eternal altar. Every notion does not reveal his majesty. In fact, most of his manifestations are decidedly and distinctly on the stupid side. This implies that there has to be inside of himself not only an eternal wisdom that keeps him alive in spite of himself, but an eternal stupidity that makes sure that he will not live well while he does live. This also was observable if you wanted to look at it that way. The Greeks noticed it in passing, but were not quite certain what to do about it, and came to the conclusion that it was part of this nature that had to be gradually regenerated by initiation into the rituals and the mysteries, through philosophy, and through the dedication of life to spiritual purposes. In the East, however, this personality was not generally accepted as being the real self. Now, if we take man and we separate from him all of the functions which are imperfect, take away, strip from his nature that which is not demonstrably eternally so, what do we have left? For the average, nothing. We may have only one enduring factor, and that is that right or wrong, good or bad, for better or for worse, he lives. There is a principle of life within him. There is a principle which also, even in the most skeptical, seems to provide an infinite inducement. Man has the capacity to be so much more than he is. He chooses to be small, or chooses to follow other people that are small. Yet there is something locked away in him which is eternal. Perhaps the Eastern thinker is a little more modest than the Western. Western peoples have always liked to move things into categories and let them sit there. Aristotle was a past master of this. Perhaps the Eastern thinker is a little more humble. In any event, he is not so quick, generally speaking, to try to define the nature of the infinite. He is not quite so quick to formularize a definition of the infinite life in which man exists and which seems to exist in man. He is more inclined to assume that this infinite life is inconceivable, that by the very fact that man must use a partly developed brain even to create a definition of the infinite, that this definition is little better than an inadequate symbol at best. Therefore, truly, to define deity is to defile deity. The infinite nature simply cannot be comprehended by finite man. Therefore, the Eastern mystic is very slow to say, God wants this, or God wants that, or God decrees anything, because he strongly suspects that he is merely using the word to express his own preferences, and that deity really is not well enough understood, well enough to comprehend it, to answer this mystery. So in the East, there has been a tendency to create a situation which more or less binds existence into a package without the use of the infinite heaven of Christendom or the infinite progression of the Greeks. In the first place, the Eastern mind apparently was far more introspective, far more mystically inclined from very far back. This doesn't always apparently demonstrate itself, but there are overtones which imply it. And the Eastern thinker at some very remote time decided that his own survival as a person was not particularly important. Also, however, he did not believe in materialism. He did not believe that man went down into the dust to sleep forever. He was more inclined to think of man returning to the substance of reality to sleep forever. He was thinking of an infinite condition into which all finite natures were ultimately resolved again. Thus, to him, man became deity, not a God. And the motion of life was back to unity, and that in the united condition of life, that which was eternal reality, eternal love, and eternal wisdom, absorbed back into its own eternity all of the emanations of its own nature, just as the plant growing from the earth falls back into the earth again. So these other great plants growing from the sky grew downward into creation, and in the fullness of time fell back into space and vanished. That a strange, invisible, all-powerful, all-dominant value is the ultimate, rather than the infinite conditioning with which man is so commonly involved. In this way, Buddhism and many other ascetic religions and some mystical groups of the Near East and West have come to the common conclusion that man's happiness, man's infinite security, man's ultimate peace rested in his re-identification with deity. That by a final at-one-ment, man atoned for all of the separateness through which he had passed. That actually man, if he is a spark from the eternal flame, it is the flame which gathers back the sparks and becomes again that which it was, the eternal flame. To work this problem out, however, the East had to face, therefore, the great dilemma, which, of course, is the West's principal objection to Buddhism, namely that Buddhism is a doctrine of spiritual nihilism, that it is a doctrine of all things returning again to a state of non-existence, and the individual who has earned so much and learned so much gradually disappears into an infinite condition. Let us ask, however, in the East how this might be solved or rationalized, not necessarily merely in conflict with the West, but merely in a statement of its own Eastern perspective. Let us then ask a few questions rather Socratically, because they have a bearing on this. What is it that life or experience or rebirth or anything which we wish to consider as a conditioning factor, what is the end which this seeks to attain? The answer, obviously, is that this end must be improvement of some kind. Man does not suffer for the pleasure of being miserable. The individual suffers even every day in order to gather experience by which he may prevent similar suffering in the future. Therefore, if an individual becomes all-wise, presumably, and theoretically, what is his relationship to the universe? Does he become different? Or does he become the same? If man, by becoming infinitely wise and eternally alive, is the same as the universe, then this so-called growth must verge toward identity. If, however, man, by becoming infinitely wise and infinitely good, is different from the universe, and therefore capable of subsisting apart from it, how are we going to define then the nature of the universe? What are we going to do with a universe that is different from the good? Different from life, different from wisdom, different from love. If we take this ground that there is this difference, and that man, by outgrowing the world, continues to exemplify virtue and can go on continually, then we have to assume that man is in some way capable of becoming superior to his own source. He must have a subsistence apart from the universe. If he is good and is different, then the universe cannot be good. It has to be something else. And when we recognize that the height of virtue for man is identical with the presumed virtue of God, then we cannot assume that man can be different from God. Therefore, growth is toward similarity or sameness. And the ultimate concept of similarity, of things becoming more and more alike, the ultimate concept is final identity. Things becoming more and more alike ultimately become the same. And that which is the same is one with that with which it is the same. This was an early Greek thought, and we've never been able to disprove it in spite of our higher mathematics. So in the Eastern thinking, man's growth is a process by means of which he is able to become the same with that which is infinitely true. And achieving this state of sameness, he attains a state of oneness. This still does not answer the principal objection which has been raised of man's loss of individual selfness. But the answer to this lies again in a matter of degree and audacity. The Eastern thinker declines to attempt to postulate either man in the state of his own infinite or the infinite from which man arose. The East simply declines to say whether this absolute existence is in any way compromised by our own attitude. For example, assuming that consciousness is an aspect of eternal existence, the East refuses to define the essential nature of consciousness per se. It refuses to be caught in the net as to whether this is consciousness or self-consciousness, but is inclined to the attitude that there is a consciousness superior to self-consciousness, which, being superior, cannot be deficient in anything which exists in self-consciousness, but is infinitely greater. This greaterness beyond self-consciousness we do not understand. We cannot define it adequately, and it is unlikely that we shall do so for a long time. As Buddha therefore pointed out in one of his discourses, nirvana, which is supposedly the complete end of the individual in the universal, is not necessarily a condition of nihilism or annihilation. It does not mean that the individual no longer exists. It does not mean that the universal is no longer distinguishable. It means that the function of life, having attained identity or reality, moves for the first time onto a positive level. That this positive level unfolds on a level of condition utterly beyond our comprehension. Therefore, the death of individuality as we know it may be the beginning of it in its true nature. All we know is that the individual, growing, moves from a state of separateness closer and closer to a state of union. That this state of union implies ultimate identity. That our ultimate identity implies the ultimate, complete integration of the divine power. That whatever the seeds were that were scattered through space, they are drawn together again. And the eternal in its fullness and in its total nature is again available in its totality. What the relation of this is to the person who has been restored to the eternal nature is just as mysterious as the relation of those who have passed on, who are said to have gone to sleep in Abraham's bosom. No one is very certain just the location of this or any of the details. It simply is a symbolic term to indicate rest. And it is also in the East that the total condition of ultimate man as we can conceive that is simply a symbolic term to indicate the end of segregation and segmentation, the end of division, the end of inadequacy, and the emergence of a total state of adequacy. To attempt to define this from a position of being inadequate creatures beggars the problem entirely. It labors it beyond any meaning. So we have in the West the idea of a self becoming more of a self forever. We have in the East a self, an I am, that gradually returns to a state of union with the only I am with a capital spelling, the only one, the total, the return to the life, heart, and mind of deity. To Western man, the idea of going home to God is very pleasant. He has often used it in poetry, in religion, and scripture. But he has never philosophically analyzed the meaning of the term. He hasn't assumed that this going home might mean to return as a spiritual entity to the spiritual substance from which entities are derived. That in the end, therefore, all things are reawakened as God, and that the true being in all things is the God in that thing, and that it is this submerged deity which now energizes the illusionary personality, the false self, which when gradually redeemed and regenerated, voluntarily sacrifices its mortal existence in order that the immortal in it and with it may have its full expression and manifestation. So mystics of both the East and West have held the position that growth or spiritual attainment of a true nature means the subordination of the ego, means the individual achieving that state in which it is the divine and not the human in him that is obeyed. Now we find, therefore, that in the West, where the egoism concept is the strongest, and where the development of the cosmic Superman concerned Western culture for better than 2,000 years, religion comes forward with the doctrine of humility. This humility would seem to be completely contrary to the idea of the continuance of an ever more aggressive self. So we have in Christian mysticism and in Christian disciplines and in Christian penances, we have always this emphasis upon overcoming the self, overcoming the selfishness, the self-purpose, the worldliness, anything which relates to gratification of self. This developed into such an elaborate doctrine of sin that there was almost nothing that an individual could do that wasn't wrong. In a sense of the word, the East would agree with this, and asceticism has been strong with them, but from a different basic motivation. The idea, however, in the West that we must sublimate the self would seem to be a step toward the East, for it would imply that the true purpose of man is that the divine shall be revealed through him, that not his will but the will of the eternal be done. And the Greek and the Oriental both have united in the recognition that personal purposes, particularly those of a selfish or dictatorial nature, are contrary to the greater good of the God in man. That the more the personality and its concerns dominate, the less opportunity there is for the eternal and its purposes to be made known. There also in both is the inevitable conviction that what we term security, what we term happiness, what we term well-being, all derive from the victory of the divine over the human in the battle of our own individuality. That man's only hope for the things which he seeks and needs is finally obedience to the eternal. This obedience to the eternal must then result from the breaking down of the superegoism which has dominated Western culture. Now we think of the superegoist as a rather important person because he is the one that builds empire. But we also realize that we are building an ever more fallible empire. That as rapidly as we build greater cities, we create greater devices to destroy them. Therefore, our way of life is not secure, and no achievement on the external part of our nature can guarantee us against the hour of pain of the great misery which must rise from the abuse of the potential values of life. So I would say that there is a definite union in mysticism and also in orthodox religious thinking, that regardless of whether the individual thinks of himself as going on and on forever, or whether he regards himself as a kind of dream from which he will awaken to find once more that he is united with divinity, whether his end is heaven or nirvana. In mysticism, the doctrine of the East and West find common ground in the conviction that the only solution to the problem of life is the reduction of the pressure of the ego, that the I am must be restated to signify only its capital significance, the capital I am signifying God, not personal self, and that this personal self must become receptive to the will of heaven, and that this will of heaven is revealed to man, not out of the sky or the earth primarily, but out of himself, once he has reduced the ego pressure, so that the person who has relaxed the purposes of the I am in its small sense thus becomes capable of the true instruction which nature intends, and that is the instruction which flows into all creation from this mysterious I am with the capital form of concept. Yet in the East, this I am would not be so stated. It would be more stated merely as an eternal fact. But in either East or West, the need of the individual to recognize existence as a motion toward obedience, a motion toward the acceptance of the universal, rather than an effort to dominate the universal. Such acceptance is the final end of growth, the final end of maturing. And all peoples who have attained maturity have come to that ultimate conclusion, namely that man's hope of true knowledge lies in his ability to sublimate himself, to remove his personality as an obstacle to the unfoldment of universal principle in space. If he is able to do these things, if he is able to achieve this even to a slight degree, sublimating each day some small part of his utter egoism, he will ultimately find the advantages of an increasing universality of consciousness. This is a common belief in both, and the mystical experience in the East and West this experience has no essential demarcations. The individual reaching a certain type of inward understanding experiences a similar, if not identical, unfoldment of internal resource. Time's up. Now I'm going to ask all of you if you will be patient this morning, because I really have some announcements to make. So you might just as well just rest for a moment while we make them. Next Sunday morning, our subject is conscious growth by self-direction, training the faculty of attention. We hope you will be there. On the table this morning, we have some mimeograph notes which include past lectures. We have one this morning on capital punishment, and we have one on Eastern concepts of healing through meditation and mystical disciplines. So we hope that you will remember these as you consider our books. I'd like to point out that on October 29th and 30th, we are having the most ambitious and unusual open house that we have held here up to the present time. On Saturday and Sunday, the Friends of the Society are going to really do everything possible to give you a very unusual and interesting time, and we hope that you will certainly plan to be with us, if not both days, on the most convenient of these days. I'd like to also make note that on Sunday, I believe it's the 30th, we will have at 4:30 the concert by Mr. Rudolph Gruen. This concert, I think you will find very interesting. I've been working with him for some time, and we have been planning and studying this music of Saint Germain. He is a very capable musician, and he has arranged this music from the original score published in 1770, which we have the original in our library, and he is going to perform part of it as a brief concert for the benefit of the society on Sunday afternoon, October 30th at 4:30 p.m., and the friends have in the lobby at this time tickets for this occasion, which you can purchase now and reserve your seats for this concert at 4:30 on Sunday. We hope you will be here anyway and take advantage of this unusual affair. As far as we are able to know, the music of the Comte Saint-Germain, to whom we turn with much interest for the numerous and amazing activities of his life. This music is comparatively unknown to the modern world. It is not available so far as we can learn anywhere, and I have heard that the opera from which these selections are taken, L'On Constance de Luce, was performed in Paris approximately in 1770 in the Paris Opera. Up to that time, it was available, I believe, only in music score. Now, I'd like to also announce that the Birthday Club is having a luncheon today at 1:30 to honor the folks that are born under Libra. But natives of other signs and friends and so forth are invited to attend the Birthday Club luncheon today at 1:30. The details and the location where it will be held are given on the bulletin board outside, or you may ask some of the friends about it. As I have already mentioned, the tickets for the Rudolph Gruen concert may be purchased at the table today, and please reserve them for your friends or anyone whom you think will be interested. I've also been asked to note that the social wing of the Friends Committee, that's a very important wing. That is one side of the bird, and keeps one half of it in the air. The social wing is very valuable, so please cooperate with it in every way possible. On the 29th and 30th of October, the Friends Committee on Social Activities will serve coffee and cookies in both afternoons of the open house. And we hope that some of the friends here would like to contribute some of their own fine recipe of cookies. Last time some of the friends brought cookies, I did very well, and I hope to do as well next time. So I hope that for the benefit of the friends who come, those who can will help to provide some of these refreshments that are needed. It's an opportunity for everyone to get together and do something, and this is one of the best ways of developing interior understanding and friendship, so that we hope that you all get together on this. Also, suggested here that if you do consider bringing some homemade goodies of this nature, I think it's limited to mostly cookies, please be sure and bring some of those made by your favorite recipe. This will be a thrill for all the friends. Those in the lobby will also give you details concerning this activity, and I hope I haven't forgotten any of these announcements, but please do note that the 29th and 30th we are going to have a very interesting time. We have some very interesting exhibits for you, much in the spirit of our present interest in East-West relationships. I might mention that, of course, as many of you know, the great Japanese woodblock artist Hiroshige has become one of the best-loved artists in the Western world. We are going to be able to present a group of Hiroshige material almost totally unknown, including a number of very beautiful scenic prints in the best style of this great Japanese master. Also, we are going to have for you to see at that time some very interesting Chinese paper gods used in various ceremonies in the Chinese home. And we have some very unusual and remarkable pieces for you. There will be displays of folk art, and we will also have cases of material dealing with the Japanese theater, the sacred rituals and ceremonies of the No drama, and other things which we think will be new and unusual for you to consider. So we hope you will tell all your friends, bring all of them, and make Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon of the 29th and 30th of October a really gala occasion for the society. Thank you very much indeed.